Well, as more people are coming in, I'll kick off. Welcome again to the third in this series of seminars looking at mixing religion and politics, this one on the trial of Jesus and the idea of justice. I know a number of you who are joining us today will have been at the previous two seminars, and you'll know about what to expect, and you'll know a little bit about Theos. But for those who are new, Theos is a Christian think tank, and we exist to tell a better story about faith in general, Christianity specifically in contemporary public life. And of particular interest to us is the interrelationship between religion and politics. Now, in last week's seminar, Jonathan Chaplin argued that it wasn't mandatory for Christians to abandon a specific kind of Christian vocabulary, if you like, or religious people to abandon a specific religious vocabulary and to speak in public reason when they're engaged in public discussions, which has been the argument of a lot of liberal political theorists over the years. But that even if it wasn't mandatory, it might be advisable. It often was advisable to do so, even if just for the sake of courtesy and commonality. And that's pretty much the approach that Theos tends to adopt. There's an awful lot of scripture and theological reflection under the bonnet of what we do, but the appearance, the language we use is intended to engage with and to talk the same languages that we find in a plural public square, if only to avoid alienating the very people that we want to talk to. Occasionally, however, we do lift a bonnet, pop the hood, as I believe the expression in America is, because, frankly, we need to. We need to understand the logic beneath so much of the political positions and ideas that we have been advocating. And today is one of those occasions, because we'll be hearing from and engaging with David Dusenbury on his extraordinary book, The Innocence of Pontius Pilate, How the Roman Trial of Jesus Shaped History. Before I introduce David properly, typically a little bit of housekeeping. Our seminar will last for an hour or 55 minutes now, and we'll promise to stop hard at 1:30. After I've introduced David, he'll talk for 15 minutes or so, after which he and I will have a short conversations, and then we'll take questions and comments from our virtual floor. The chat box will be turned off shortly for the duration of David's talk and then our discussion. We'll put it on right at the end if people want to say goodbye. But in the meantime, the question and answer box at the bottom of your screens will be left open. And that will allow you to put through questions that David and I will be able to see. And as with previous weeks, I'll collate them and put them to David, and we'll have a conversation that will hopefully involve everybody, or at least everybody who wants to ask a question. Can I remind people, if you are going to ask a question, it's always much better to keep it relatively short and clipped, because it's just easier to digest through the process of the discussion. We are streaming live on YouTube as well as Zoom, but we'll only be taking questions from people on Zoom. And the seminar is not being recorded on Zoom, but you will be able to watch it again on YouTube. That's the housekeeping. And so to our speaker. David Lloyd Dusenbury is a visiting fellow at the Danube Institute and a visiting professor at the Eötvös Loránd University. He's lectured widely in Europe on topics of philosophy, religion, and history of ideas, and his essays and criticism have appeared in, among other places, the Times Literary Supplement and the Corriere della Serra. His books include Platonic Legislations and the latest, The Innocence of Pontius Pilate, and he also has another book coming out later on in the year called I Judge No One, A Political Life of Jesus. He lives in Budapest, where he is speaking to us from there. So, David, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for making the time. I'll give the floor to you now for you to talk about the innocence of Pontius Pilate.
Many thanks, Nick. Let me begin by saying, of course, what a pleasure it is to be with you this afternoon, and with all of you. Thanks for joining. I think it's only fair to begin by saying too that my book owes something to Nick and through him to Theos, since the very first review of the book to appear in The Spectator was Nick's, and he was very generous in his review in spring of last year. His early praise, I think, helped to speed the book on its way a bit, so I'm very grateful. I remain very grateful for that, and it's wonderful to be able to talk about it here today. Now, a question which reasonably or not, I personally tend to dread is the question, what am I trying to do in this book? So I propose to try to answer that question in the coming minutes. The first thing I try to do in The Innocence of Pontius Pilate is simply to sketch in very bold strokes, and it seems for the first time, the history of the idea of Pilate's innocence, and no less importantly, of his guilt. Now, I owe this theme, this question, to an Italian philosopher named Giorgio Agamben, who published a very short book, 60 pages, by the title of Pilate and Jesus about half a decade ago. When the book came out in English, it came to my attention, and I intended to review it. As it turns out, I never did review the book, but I hope my own work has nonetheless brought some further attention to Agamben's text. So initially, in 2017, I published a scholarly article on Pilate and Jesus. And it was only at the very end of this article that I realized that what Agamben was arguing about the Roman trial of Jesus is a very ancient thesis. So first, we can ask, what is Agamben's thesis? Now, in his own words, Agamben argues that according to the four canonical Gospels, Pilate, quote, did not pronounce a sentence of death after he interrogated Jesus on the morning of his death. Rather, in Agamben's words, Pilate simply handed Jesus over to the Sanhedrin. If, when you dialed into this event just a few moments ago, you did not know the most enduring and seemingly sophisticated Christian theory of Pilate's innocence, you now do. This is it. It's simply the idea, which you can find in numerous modern commentaries, that according to the canonical Gospels, Pontius Pilate never uttered a sentence of death at the conclusion of his interrogation of Jesus. Now, I wrote this article in 2017 because Agamben's idea is bluntly contradicted by a verse we find in the Gospel of Luke. In Luke 23:24, we read the words, Pilate gave sentence. And the Greek for this is actually perspicacious. It's very clear. What this verse means is that the Roman prefect of Judea sentenced Jesus to death by crucifixion. And I could point out, since this may be of interest to those who are here today, that Luke's gospel refers two more times to Pilate's death sentence. In Luke 23:40, one of the criminals who is flanking Jesus on Golgotha says to the other that they're all dying under the same sentence of condemnation. This is manifestly Pilate's sentence. And after the resurrection in Luke 24, we read in retrospect that Jesus had been sentenced to death. Again, in context, this refers to the sentence of Pontius Pilate. Very well. In Luke, in one of the canonical Gospels, Pilate is not simply someone who questions Jesus, he is Jesus' judge. It's Pilate who destines Jesus to the cross in a judicial and institutional sense. So sometime in the late 1st century, whoever wrote Luke and its companion piece Acts says clearly that Pilate sentences Jesus. But in the early 21st century, Agamben and many other commentators are claiming that he did not. There's clearly a conflict here. My question became, is there a history? Is there a story to be told? Now, I've already mentioned Agamben's claim, which let me repeat it here. Pilate did not pronounce a sentence upon Jesus, but simply handed him over to the Sanhedrin. Now, I'm not going to go into the original languages, but I hope you'll trust me that Agamben's modern Italian is very, very close translation of several lines written in ancient Latin by a very notable Christian author who wrote at the court of Constantine the Great by the name of Lactantius. So I discovered that in a monumental book called the Danube Institute, Lactantius claims that, quote, Pilate did not utter a sentence, but handed Jesus over to the Judeans, or depending on one's preferred translation, the Jews, to be crucified. So at the very beginning, at least, I wanted to write a book to try to explain where Lactantius's idea, which contradicts Luke, comes from, what some of its effects were, and why it has lasted as long as it has, well into the 20th and 21st centuries. So I like to think that the Innocence of Pontius Pilate answers these questions, but one thing leads to another, of course, and I found as I was working on the story of Pilate's innocence and guilt, I found myself dealing with a number of other questions, which I can perhaps mention briefly in the coming moments. First, I was led to see that the Roman trial of Jesus is not just a religious drama. Now, I think we will all agree that this drama matters to theologians and to Christians of all communions. But one of the things I tried to show in the book is that its influence is not only theological and devotional, but political and legal. I've already mentioned that Lactantius, whom we've been discussing, was a courtier at the court of Constantine the Great. So he's no fringe figure. And one of the things I try to show in the book is that many other learned commentaries on the Roman trial of Jesus were not fringe figures either. So for instance, in chapter 2, I look at someone who's commonly regarded, I mean, in most European law faculties, what you'll hear is that the first modern theorist of modern international law is a Dutch jurist named Hugo Grotius. So Grotius is mainly remembered for a text he published in 1625 called The Laws of War and Peace. But I was astonished to find that Grotius also penned a play, a verse drama, by the title of Christ's Suffering, in which he dramatizes the Roman trial of Jesus. And beyond this, he comments meticulously on the Roman trial in his single largest work, which is a colossal 12-volume commentary on the Old and New Testaments, which lawyers no longer read because it's a commentary on the Bible, and theologians no longer really read because it's written by a lawyer. But I hope to have shown in chapter 2 that Grotius's reading is of interest to many. So I could go on, but I won't. The point is a very simple one. The question of Pilate's innocence led me to revisit many figures in the European legal tradition with the question of Pilate and Jesus in mind. What did these legal writers and theologians have to say about Pilate and Jesus? Where did they get their ideas, and where did those ideas lead them? So this leads me to my second big argument in the book, to speak very, very simply. While I was revisiting many iconic texts in European legal history with the question of Pilate's innocence in mind, I began to suspect that one of the things that Jesus says to Pilate in the fourth gospel, John, was similarly interpreted by many important thinkers from the beginning of the 1300s to the end of the 1700s. The line is this: "My kingdom is not of this world," as John says, as Jesus says in John 18:36. Time and again, in text after text, I found that this saying by Jesus is brought to the fore and interpreted in similar ways. Century after century, thinkers as diverse as Marsilius of Padua, who was a 14th century Catholic in Italy, Thomas Hobbes, a 17th century Protestant in England, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who by turns is both a Protestant, a Catholic, and a post-Christian in 18th century France. Figures as diverse as these and many others interpret Jesus saying before Pilate in a similar way. They see this as a world historical declaration of the different logics and zones of church and empire, religion and politics, sacred and secular, free belief and coercion. So we've already heard where Giorgio Agamben seems to have gotten his idea of Pilate's innocence, and that's from a 4th century Christian named Lactantius. Now I want to ask, in my last few moments, where do many of the European thinkers I've just referred to, where do they get their idea, directly or indirectly, of the meaning of Jesus' utterance before Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world"? And this question can be answered, I propose, in one word, which is Augustine. Augustine of Hippo interprets this line, "My kingdom is not of this world," in a way that I try to show has profound and manifold effects on later European thought and politics. many of these effects seem to me to shape the European history of what we call the secular. Without some sense of Augustine's influence, I suggest it's impossible for us to reconstruct or to appreciate a history of the secular in Europe and thus in the Americas. But there's more, because the text in which Augustine gives his interpretation of this line of Jesus, "My kingdom is not of this world," is the same text in which he offers a brilliant interpretation of the Roman trial of Jesus in toto. This is Augustine's Homilies on the Gospel of John, an absolutely marvelous book, by the way. So I've indicated at breakneck speed that the history of European secularity seems to owe something to Augustine's Homilies, but so does the history of Pilate's innocence. For of all the early Christian writers I consulted on this topic, no one insists with greater force and rigor on the guilt of Pontius Pilate than does Augustine of Hippo. So let me just conclude by some remarks on Augustine. We've already heard that Lactantius denies that Pilate utters a sentence of death. Augustine breaks sharply with this entire early Christian tradition of the canonical passions and gives rise to an importantly different Christian tradition. Augustine makes clear that the Romans sent Pilate to Judea as governor, and he makes absolutely clear that Jesus was sentenced to death. Augustine writes, "Pilate on his days judged and condemned Jesus to death. Jesus dies, according to Augustine, by the judgment and power of the governor." Now, Lactantius claims, this is a claim which has very dark effects in later European history. Lactantius claims that the Judeans, or the Jews, hoisted Jesus up between two criminals. So the crucifixion was actually carried out not by Romans, but by Judeans. I talk a bit about this, this tradition in the book and some of its lamentable effects. I think this claim has no backing in the canonical Gospels, and Augustine agrees. He states very clearly that Roman troops obeyed the governor in crucifying Jesus. So, as I hope to have indicated in the foregoing moments, I try to do more than one thing in the Innocence of Pontius Pilate. First, just to establish that the question of Pilate's innocence has a long and forgotten history. Second, to show that the history of this question is not only religious or theological, but also legal and political. And third, to indicate that this question of Pilate's guilt or innocence in the Roman trial of Jesus bears in complicated ways upon the emergence of what we could call secularity in Europe, and also tragically upon the history of Christian anti-Semitism in Europe. But the event's title refers to the idea of justice. And so before I close my opening remarks, I want to say just a few words about the idea of justice in Augustine's thought. For Augustine, human justice is secular, and this is a word he uses to describe the governments of this world and of this age. For Augustine, human justice is secular because it is practiced in the absence of true divine judgment. Secular justice for him is by definition imperfect justice. And for him, the church is meant to be a symbol, a presence in the world of a reign in which a higher mode of justice is promised, one that is not of this world. Now, in his homilies on the Gospel of John, which I've been very, very briefly discussing, Augustine doesn't thematize secular justice, but he does write about it quite stirringly in his great work, The City of God, in which he really dwells upon, in book 19, what he calls the ignorance of the judge. Judicial ignorance is a form which Augustine says frequently involves an innocent person in suffering. Now, I think in context, Augustine is mainly referring here to the practice of judicial torture in late antiquity. This is a widespread practice that Augustine does advert to in his homilies when he refers to the injuries that Pilate and his cohort inflicted on Christ, not after Pilate had sentenced him to death, but during the trial of Jesus. This is a theme which actually comes back in a number of early modern Enlightenment era treatises, which I discuss in the book. So I do believe, in conclusion, I do believe the drama of Pilate and Jesus informs Augustine's idea of justice. He holds that human secular judgments, the grim system of courts and sentences and punishments, he holds that all these are necessary in cities. This is his conclusion. And who could deny that? They are necessary. But the hard-headed bishop whose divine city is first revealed in the judicial murder of an innocent man whom Augustine holds to be God, he's under no illusion. Secular verdicts are the judgments humans pronounce upon humans, he says. As such, they're fallible and often cruel. Most human judgments remain, in Augustine's words, quote, melancholy and lamentable. They derive not only from human laws and insights, but from human ignorance and prejudice. Divine or perfect judgments they are not. And it is not only the church that has scandals which will be with us until the very end of the age. Secular order is scandalous too. It's with his eye on human empires that Augustine says in The City of God that human justice is often something to be mourned and, if it were possible, washed away with fountains of tears. He's not referring here to Jesus' death in the Gospel of John, but to the deaths of numberless others who never had or have any hope of secular justice. Among other things, I think Jesus' death is emblematic of that. Thank you.
David, thank you very much indeed. As forensic as indeed the book is, and there are various things I want to pick up. I would encourage our audience to start asking questions. We have a couple in, and already one very importantly on this critical issue of the connection with this and Christian anti-Semitism. And I definitely want to address that. And I particularly want to make sure we arrive at this critical point around the kind of the implications of what you've been talking about. But I want to trace just a little bit of history beforehand. You've touched on quite a bit, but there's more in the book. The Gospels are clear. Pilate is responsible for Jesus' death, and you point out three particular instances in Luke, and Augustine is clear and direct. Lactantius, and as we'll come on to many others, aren't. Is that because there are certain Christians like Lactantius who are sitting in the court of the Roman Empire, and they basically want to get the Roman Empire or the Roman emperor off the hook? Is that what's driving that particular narrative there, do you think?
Well, I mean, to some extent, Nick, this is an excellent question, and I'm not sure. I was careful in my opening remarks to say I try to trace back where this idea comes from, but I do not claim to have traced back why exactly the idea emerges. And the most I say in the book is that given the milieu in which Lactantius was writing, this was a highly politic supposition to make, that the Romans were not, in fact, ultimately responsible for Jesus' death. Beyond that, it's not that I'm not prepared to go, but I have no firm ground on which to stand in determining what his motivations were. This is a recurring theme in early Christian literature, which we can discuss further, and it's definitely, there seems to emerge. I don't think it's there. I absolutely agree with you. I don't think it's there in the New Testament writings, but it does emerge early, this double impulse to exculpate the Romans and inculpate the Judeans or the Jews. And the two, I suppose, would have had a variety, these two impulses would have had a variety of sources, some of which are sociological, and others of which are perhaps more, I hesitate to say theological, but to have, yep. I realize this is a rather disappointing way to begin, but it's an honest answer, yeah? No,
it's fine. But I mean, it's very difficult to trace the motivations of people whose texts we have 1700 years ago, but we don't have their personal private diary. But I'm kind of hinting at this point about there's, as you kind of confirmed, there's a certain internal logic to the idea of wanting to get the emperor, the newly Christianized emperor, off the hook. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things you say in the book about, and it's important to emphasize that this tradition is singularly a Christian tradition. You talk a pagan text that forcefully made the governor's case, at least according to the historian Eusebius, and more surprisingly, certainly from my point of view, that there was, you say, a Talmudic tradition which proudly proclaimed Jesus' responsibility for Jesus' death. And there's also an Islamic tradition as well. Can you just say a little bit about the other traditions that have tried to push this particular line?
Yes. So, I mean, this is what, in a sense, the third part of the book is entirely devoted to, are the four great traditions and their various ways of dealing with the figure of Pilate. And what I was struck by in early days thinking about this was, of course, you were just asking, why did the Christians or many Christian communities seek to exculpate Pilate? But it seems to me crucial to situate that question within a broader recognition that Christianity is by no means the only tradition to exculpate Pilate. Quite the contrary. What emerges when you look at pagan, Judaic, and Islamic traditions is that what's peculiar about Christianity is that one way or another, it holds on to Pilate's guilt, right? Pilate is in the creed as the one under whom Jesus is crucified. And so this is actually, when one looks at the three other great traditions, which all of which refer to the death of Jesus, this is what emerges, is that it's actually not the innocence, but rather the guilt of Pilate that's striking. So we have a number of texts and testimonies from pagan sources, which say that Jesus was rightly crucified. One I think you refer to is actually a propagandistic text called the Memoirs of Pilate, which was put forward by a figure I refer to as the last pagan emperor in the early 4th century, as kind of a systematic rebuttal of the idea that Rome was in any way culpable for the death of Jesus. And then indeed, there are very, very early testimonies attributed to Judaic sources, which seem to reappear in definitely Judaic sources, such as the Talmud and the Torah de Yeshu, in which Pilate is not in any way implicated in the death of Jesus, and the Jerusalem courts are. Peter Schaeffer is a German scholar who's published quite a bit about this. And it's in many ways to us a shocking sort of tradition to explore, because there is such a strong claim of ownership for the death of Jesus. And so I try to point out that at least in this context, the Christian declaration of Pilate's hand in the death of Jesus is something to be appreciated and lauded and reflected upon. And then in the Islamic tradition, of course, there's actually a stanza in the Quran which refers to the crucifixion, which is again attributed. It's both attributed and denied. That what the Quran says is that the Jews, the Judeans, claim to have crucified Jesus, which is an idea we heard about earlier and via Lactantius. And the Quran says, no, the Judeans did not crucify Jesus. Jesus wasn't crucified at all. And so Pilate is exculpated in a complicated way we could discuss further by the Quran clearly rejecting the crucifixion to core. And then the question for Islamic tradition is, why is there talk of a crucifixion? Why is there a cross? And there are various theories which account for the Christian, veneration of the cross, which I try to untangle in the book.
Thank you. A few questions coming in. I'm going to stay on the historical theme for a bit before we move on to the legal and political implications. And there's one question, which is quite a specific one, so it may be quite a short answer. And you've given from Ollie, you've given a great overview of European narratives. Have you come across non-Eurocentric texts or narratives on Pilate and the relationship with divine justice?
So the short answer is no, I have not. And I will say that I was actually surprised there's not more literature on the death of Jesus in, for instance, the Islamic and the Judaic traditions. Now, there are literatures, there is scholarly work to be consulted, but I had to do quite a bit of work to even write the chapters I have written on these themes. So that's a desideratum.
I wouldn't consider it a criticism. It's a substantial and meaty book anyway, and you have to draw the line somewhere. There's a couple of questions about the Gospels themselves. I'll just pick up one of them. From Claire, the Gospel of John is less clear than the one of Luke on the role of Pilate. I think this intertextuality is the main reason for this debate on the responsibility of Pilate. I guess that's making kind of reflection on whether there are different approaches to this issue that you discerned in the Gospels, and I guess in particular between the Synoptic Gospels and John's Gospel.
So I argue that there is not a discernible difference. And in John, for instance, I referred very, very briefly, I think in my remarks, or perhaps I skipped that paragraph. But the titulus, so the Roman declaration of who Jesus is, which doubles as a declaration of why he's dying, because he's been proclaimed as the King of the Judeans. This appears in all four Gospels. John actually makes it clearer than anyone else that Pilate wrote this declaration himself in all three relevant languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And there's also a verse in John where it says he sat on the judgment seat, the bema in Greek, to declare his sentence, or the implication is he sat on the bema to declare his sentence. So there are variants in the Ionian manuscript tradition, one of which indicates that Pilate sat Pilate sat Jesus on the judgment seat. And this, I think, should be treated as a variant which is actually meant to muddy the waters. This is how the best interpreters, to my mind, read it. John also uniquely points out, and this is why I praise Augustine's reading of the Gospels, because it's only Augustine who picks up on the fact that John says there was a cohort which was involved in the apprehension of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Augustine registers the fact, which modern exegetes would concur with, that this signals Roman involvement in the arrest. So Augustine, as I try to argue, is attuned to the fact that even in John, the trial is Roman before it even becomes a trial. The Romans are involved from the very beginning. And I could say more, but
yeah. I'm going to come on to Augustine in a bit more detail in a minute, because he's absolutely central to everything you've said and to the broader argument. But I do want to pick up a question that Nigel's asked, and you mentioned as well, and it's very, very important for all the obvious reasons. How influenced were writers in medieval times by the general understanding that the Jews were responsible for Jesus' death? Only yesterday, he says, I came across Alfred the Great's writings on the Psalms, where he makes several references to the guilt of, quote, the Jews for Jesus' death. I reflect on that as well, in the light of, I guess, that the wider context is that, if Lactantius and others played down Pilate's guilt to try and get Roman emperors off the hook, is it also the case that, scroll forward to the medieval period, as Nigel's hinting there, that other Christian writers did the same thing to put the Jews on the hook? In other words, being driven by this Christian anti-Semitic trope that found its succor in the idea that Pontius Pilate was innocent. Tell us about your reflections on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, the brief answer is yes. I certainly think this is correct, that the interpretation of the Passion seems to be historically motivated in various times in various ways by animosity towards the Jewish minorities in Europe and the Christian East. And I have an entire chapter devoted to the argument that that this is in no way rooted in the Gospels or Acts. I argue that both in Acts and some of Paul's letters, there are very, very clear differentiations made which exculpate everyone involved, Pilate and the Sanhedrin, for the death of Christ, even though every law court in Judea which could have been involved was involved in putting Jesus to death. And of course, it goes without saying that for all the authors of the New Testament, Jesus is the Christ. So it's a very subtle argument which I try to make, which hinges upon judicial ignorance, which we just heard about in Augustine's sermons on John. So to really sort of keep it simple, I would say that Nigel's question is absolutely reasonable, and I think huge amounts of work have been done on this and remain to be done on this. But I did find a couple of fascinating texts by a Jewish historian who has traced up Augustine's influence in medieval Christian thought. And he argues, I cite him in the book, and he argues that basically, I mean, one has to simplify, but where Augustine's influence was strongest in some of the mendicant orders, Christian anti-Semitism seems to have been tempered the most. And so it does seem to me that Augustine's recognition of Pilate's guilt, Pilate's hand throughout the Passion did have, let's say, salutary effects in medieval Europe. But they were counterbalanced by other traditions, Lactantius and so on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's turn to Augustine and make this move from what we've been talking about, which is extremely interesting, but historical, to, as it were, the implications, the reverberations this has, and particularly on our idea of secularism or the notion of the secular and our conception of justice as well. I haven't read, I confess, Augustine's homilies on the Gospel of John, and I loved what I read about them in your book, and his withering pronouncements on the capacity for human justice to deliver true justice. But the question, Tola has asked a number of questions, quite a long question here, but I want to pick up one particular bit from it, which is that there's a danger of being almost fatalistic in the suggestion that human justice is flawed, and that it's allegedly, possibly even a futile pursuit. Now, I'm inclined to approve of the idea that what Augustine is doing there is demoting human justice and recognizing its imperfection. But Tola's point there is that, can that be unduly fatalistic? Can that simply turn us away from any faithfulness in human justice at all? Is there a risk that that would happen?
I mean, I certainly think there is that risk. It seems to me that certainly in Augustine, but I would argue to some extent in the Gospels as well, the heightening of the idea of justice. I mean, Jesus actually says, "Be perfect," right? Well, this is impossible. It's an impossible idea of justice. And so the heightening of the idea of justice also heightens a recognition of the flaws, and to some extent, one would say the futilities, the imperfections. One word that comes to my mind, the tragic nature of human efforts toward justice in history. So I think there is something very true and necessary, and in a certain way, beautiful about this aspect, this kind of tragic sense that Christianity brings to legal thinking and legal culture, the recognition of how many innocent have been condemned, and how difficult it is for humans. This is, of course, thematized in the gospel, how difficult it is for humans to judge themselves or others rightly, right? I mean, this is really a primitive Christian insight or motif or theme. But at the same time, of course, the heightening of the idea of justice can and should serve as a spur to seek justice, and a recognition of the gravity and the tragedy of innocence being condemned should lead us to seek means to prevent these outcomes. And to be fair, I mean, I think Augustine was rather politically engaged, often not entirely in ways that we could approve of now. I mean, the question of the Donatists is certainly a vexed and a complicated one. But I mean, you know, he has a number of letters writing to various magistrates pleading for clemency, right? when people had been apprehended. And so I think within his own corpus, we see signs of and of course, Augustine's theory of providence is in the picture here too. We could discuss that. But I think within Augustine's corpus and those of many other bishops, we see signs of an active and a persistent desire to minimize human injustice.
Justice is obviously a word that comes up in a lot of these legal discussions, but as you pointed out, there are significant political implications in everything that we've been talking about in the trial. And the word that comes to my mind is chastened, the idea that recognizing the guilt of the supreme political and legal representative in the trial of Jesus actually helps to chasten political authority, or chasten earthly political authority. And it strikes me as well, that is entirely in keeping with a much longer tradition within the Hebrew scriptures, when, for example, the Hebrews are asking for a king to be put over themselves. The prophet Samuel, isn't it? He warns them that you can be like the other nations as you want to be like the other nations, but be aware that a king will exploit you. And even though in the law there is the edict that the king should be underneath the law, underneath the Torah, and subservient to it as everybody else is, we all know what kings do. So, the implications of this whole incident of justice is significant. But it strikes me that the way it chastens earthly power is even more important, isn't it?
No, I think that's a wonderful word, chastening. And I mean, even in the Roman trial of Jesus in John, which is the only gospel in which there's a proper sort of dialogue between the Roman judge and the provincial who is not a Roman, who becomes the convict. I mean, Jesus makes it perfectly clear that there is a truth and a power under which Pilate stands, whether he recognizes this or not. And so I think from the very beginning, the recognition of the secular authorities, but even the denomination of secular authorities as secular was intended to situate them within a higher system of authority, which, I mean, I was actually quite touched. I don't know if this will be welcome to you or your hearers, but I do recall at the funeral of Prince Philip, when he was called a knight and so on and so forth, and a brother and a servant. These were the last words proclaimed before he was committed to the ground. And this idea that our rulers are subjects with us to eternal and unvarying standards under which we all stand judged, I think is another salutary recognition.
Question from Graham. Is it not the case that Europeans in particular, who see Roman law as the basis of their legal system, while assuming Christianity as foundational for European civilization, resist as fundamentally threatening the notion that Roman law could have crucified Jesus, brackets, which would confirm Augustine on the fallibility of the legal system? Quite a long question, but I'll read it through again. Is it not the case that Europeans in particular, who see Roman law as the basis of their legal system, resist as fundamentally threatening the notion that Roman law could have crucified Jesus?
That is a very good question, and it's tough to answer, I must say. I mean, the first thing to say in reply is that to some extent, this is the topic of chapter 1. I don't know if you recall, Nick, but I start the book by pointing out that the introductory text to the great corpus of Roman law, which has come down to us, which is the Institutes of Justinian, which is kind of a précis of the entire Roman legal tradition before the early 6th century. The very first words of this text, which no one pays attention to, are in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so the book sort of begins with this question: what is the name of a Roman convict doing at the head of the entire Roman legal tradition as it is transmitted within Europe? And I think, well, there are very, very many answers which could be made to that. But I suppose one would be, I mean, we've already said that Augustine is to some extent a critic of the Roman Empire, to some extent. I mean, these things have to be handled very carefully. And so one could say that Augustine's sort of critical stance toward imperial power might inform and reinforce, or be reinforced by, his reading of the Roman trial of Jesus. And thus those with a less critical stance towards Roman imperial history or Roman legal culture might be tempted to adopt a different view. But I mean, and Europeans who are not devout might be happy, a number are happy, to adopt the kind of ancient claim that Pilate was perfectly justified in pronouncing a sentence of death. I try to argue that to some extent Jean-Jacques Rousseau represents the return of this ancient orientation, this ancient attitude at the beginning of the Enlightenment, or the middle of the Enlightenment. But one could also point out the fact that in terms of Roman law, I mean, Roman law did not literally, straightforwardly apply to Jesus because he was, as I just said, he was not a citizen. And Roman legal forms ultimately only applied to citizens. So the hearing which was held, so I try both to recognize the fact, which I think is indisputable, that the hearing that was held was called cognitio extra ordinem, so an extraordinary hearing, which was what prefects, such as Pontius Pilate, were authorized to do in the provinces. They were authorized to basically oversee questions of justice and punishment for those who were not citizens. So neither the accusers nor the accused in the trial of Jesus were citizens, which changes in the early 3rd century. But nonetheless, the cognitio extra ordinem resulted in a legally valid form of punishment, which is indicated by the sentence of death and the titulus on Jesus' cross. Yeah. So if one wanted to say that Pilate was wrong to sentence Jesus, and one wanted to say there's no problem with Roman legal culture, I don't know why. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Roman legal culture, but I wouldn't say that there's no problem with it. Yeah. If one wanted to do that, one could point to the extraordinary nature of the trial.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned actually at the beginning of the book, Dan, you're talking about the Institutes of Justinian. One of the other points you make early on, I recall, and this is less of a question, more of an observation, but I think one's worth making, is that we do, I mean, I did it myself actually earlier on in the conversation when Ollie's question about Eurocentric tradition, we kind of slip into the mistake of seeing Augustine as part of the Eurocentric tradition, when of course he's born in North Africa, he's a bishop in North Africa, he writes in North Africa, it's an African tradition. And you do point out that, you know, we infrequently enough recognize the significance of that African contribution to this seminal moment in, ironically, what became European history.
Indeed, absolutely, yeah.
Let me put a slightly more kind of challenging question to us. If some of my secular friends were in on this conversation, they would say to us, lovingly, of course, you're both being very naive here. You're putting forward this idea that this event brought forward a tragic conception of justice and a chastened idea of political authority. But if you read European history, more or less from any time from the 5th century up to the early 20th century, you see a very close allegiance of throne and altar, as it used to be called. So actually, is this not just theory? And in reality, no matter how chastened political and legal authority is, the church and Christians got into bed with it very comfortably for a very long time.
Well, I suppose I would say that, to my mind, both of these claims can be, I mean, on the one hand, I would say both of these claims can be true, that the interpretation of the Roman trial of Jesus did have certain effects, and these effects were sort of critical of the alignment of church, throne and altar. I think this is demonstrably correct. I try to show this in the book. And these particular receptions of the Roman trial of Jesus are critical of the, collusion of throne and altar, precisely because they were colluding, right? Precisely because a system was constructed whereby the church found itself handling all sorts of business in the ancient Latin sense of business that, according to many Christians, it should not be handling. But I suppose I would, while recognizing that, I would nonetheless want to stress a couple of things beyond that. And I do think that even at its worst, Christian legal culture has certain contributions which I think have not been entirely appreciated. There's some very interesting work on the emergence of the idea of a legal individual in late medieval legal culture, which I think is not often enough pointed out in, let's say, contemporary public discourse. One of the fellows I referred to in the book, named Agobard of Lyon, was a rather fierce polemicist when it came to Jews, which this is a complicated question, but let's say his influence there is not entirely positive. But he was very influential, a bishop. He was very influential in trying to eliminate, at least theoretically, undermine the legitimacy of trial by ordeal. And this is a very, very positive legal contribution. And I suppose, so on the one hand, I think there are positive legal contributions. And on the other hand, something that has long been of interest to me when it comes to the conquest of the Americas, where I think no one could or should deny that the church is implicated in many tragic circumstances. Nevertheless, I would maintain that when one looks at the literature as a whole, the strongest critics of the most atrocious things happening in the New World were priests. They were religious. And it was the businessmen, to put it very bluntly, the businessmen and the adventurers who were seeking to have the chastening effect of Christian doctrine minimized, denied, so on and so forth. So I think that one can take a very, very critical view of Christian political history and nevertheless maintain that there are strong and persistent tendencies and contributions which we do not always appreciate.
I think it's an incredibly important point that, given the fact that the church has spanned so much of the world for such a very long time, one shouldn't expect it to be univocal, let alone its example to be univocal. There are lots of different strands there to tease apart. I want to squeeze in one more question, and I'm conscious that in doing so, we'll kind of, as it were, bringing this conversation right up to date. And in previous conversations that you and I have had, you said you are an intellectual historian, so I don't want to kind of force on you too many kind of questions which demand that you comment on contemporary affairs, but I'm going to anyway. Paul's question that I've just seen is that many rulers from Alfred to King Charles I saw their authority as divinely ordained. It's unsurprising that they felt threatened by the concept of the fallibility of earthly rulers. Absolutely right. To this day, prime ministers resent and avoid accountability for their actions. We cannot imagine who Paul is talking about there. But it does invite a question about the accountability of political power today, and whether it's too much to draw a line from what we've been talking about, from the chastening and the emphasized fallibility of political and legal authority that we see enacted in the trial of Jesus, through the filtering lens of Augustine and into some of the things you've been talking about, Latin Christendom, right to today, and the obvious point for so many of us that political authorities absolutely must be held to account. Is it too much to see an intellectual lineage all the way there, all the way through that?
I mean, this is, I'm not sure. Let me put it this way, Nick, and I hate to disappoint your questioner, but I'm not sure anything that I deal with in the book permits me to make a comment, a decisive comment on because I do actually talk a fair bit about Henry VIII and the dissolution, early modern 17th century England. I have a fair bit to say about, but post 1688 and modern constitutional Britain is something I really can't claim competence in. So I hope you'll forgive me for.
I will. It was unfair of me to ask, but I wanted to. I mean, just as an aside, when I wrote on the influence of the Bible on British political life many years ago now, I was profoundly struck by the way in which Christian radicals in the early 19th century, when they were advocating for the extension of the franchise, drew on the arguments that were used by reformers in the 16th century about accessibility to the scriptures. And the argument made was, well, if God trusts people with their eternal destiny by wanting them to make up their own minds by reading and examining the scriptures themselves, and their political destiny is self-evidently, their earthly political destiny is less significant than their eternal destiny, it is therefore incumbent on earthly authorities to grant the same degree of self-determination here. Now, not all Christians argued that by any means. The Church of England bishops, to a man, or at least in the first reading, were against the Great Reform Act. But I guess the point I'm making is that some of these historical arguments, theological and historical arguments, do resurface in more contemporary fields in questions of accountability and representation that are more familiar to us today. David, I want to thank you very much indeed for your time. The book is called The Innocence of Pontius Pilate, How the Roman Trial of Jesus Shaped History. As I said, it's a meaty tome, but it's extraordinarily erudite. And I have to say, I've never seen a puff by the Archbishop of Canterbury by Rowan Williams, which begins a quite exceptional study. So that is an extraordinary achievement in itself. And your following book is coming out later on this year, is that right?
Hopefully so.
It's called I Judge No One, The Political Life of Jesus. So thank you. I want to thank Anna Wheeler and Abby and everyone else at Theos for enabling this to happen. You've seen Abby's putting some notes in the chat there about you to check out David's book, able to give us some feedback. The other events in this series, like this one, are available on YouTube for your delectation, and there will be other seminars later on in the year, although this is the last of this particular series. So it just remains to thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and for David again for a fascinating and thoughtful discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nick.